Welcome to our channel, where we share incredible stories of courage and hope. Today, we dive into a tale that will tug at your heartstrings and keep you on the edge of your seat. Imagine a life turned upside down, a man once lost finding a new purpose in the most unexpected of places. What would you do if you found a helpless baby abandoned in the darkest corner of the city? Our story begins with Joe Mitchell, a man who's seen his fair share of heartache, and a tiny baby who changes his world forever. But this isn't just a tale of rescue. What Joe uncovers sets off a chain of events more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. Buckle up, because this journey is about to begin, and you won't want to miss a single moment. Enjoy the story as it unfolds. The night was colder than usual, a biting chill that gnawed at Joe Mitchell's bones as he trudged through the narrow, shadowy alley. His worn-out boots crunched on the gravel, echoing in the stillness of the night. Joe had walked these streets for years, his life a far cry from the comforts he once knew, but tonight something felt different. He could sense it in the air, like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. As he approached a familiar row of dumpsters, hoping to find something to stave off the gnawing hunger in his belly, a faint, almost imperceptible sound caught his ear. He stopped, straining to listen, his heart pounding harder than it had in a long time. There it was again, a soft, desperate cry. Joe frowned, scanning the darkness until his eyes landed on a rusted trash bin. His breath caught in his throat. Carefully, he lifted the lid, and there, among the discarded remnants of other people's lives, lay a baby wrapped in filthy rags. The infant's tiny face was red from crying, its eyes squeezed shut as it whimpered softly. Joe's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. Who could have done this? Why here, in this place where hope was all but forgotten? Without thinking, Joe reached in and gently scooped the baby into his arms. The child was so small, so fragile, and as it settled against his chest, something stirred within Joe, something he thought had died long ago. He knew he couldn't leave the baby there, not in this God-forsaken place. But what could he do? He was just a broken man, living in the shadows of a life that had crumbled beneath him. Joe's hands trembled as he wrapped his old, tattered coat around the baby to keep it warm. He looked around, his senses on high alert. The alley was deserted, but Joe couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He had to move quickly. With the baby clutched close, Joe made his way back to his makeshift shelter, each step filled with a growing sense of dread. The streets were treacherous, filled with dangers he knew all too well. When he finally reached his refuge, a small, hidden spot beneath an old bridge, Joe sank to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The baby had quieted, its tiny fingers clutching the fabric of Joe's coat as if sensing the safety in his arms. But Joe knew this was only the beginning. He had no idea who this child was or why it had been left to die, but one thing was certain: the world wasn't going to let them rest easily. As the night wore on, Joe couldn't sleep. He watched over the baby, feeding it with what little he could find, feeling a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, he would have to find help. Someone who could take care of this child better than he ever could. But deep down, a small voice whispered that this baby had come into his life for a reason. And for the first time in a long while, Joe found himself clinging to that thought. But in the shadows, unseen eyes were watching, and Joe's newfound purpose was about to lead him down a path more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick clouds, casting a dull, grey light over the city as Joe Mitchell emerged from his shelter. The baby, now nestled snugly in the folds of his coat, slept peacefully, unaware of the uncertainty that loomed over them. Joe knew he couldn't keep the child safe on his own. He needed help, and there was only one place he could think of: the soup kitchen, where he sometimes went for a hot meal and a bit of human contact. As Joe made his way through the busy streets, his eyes darted nervously around. The feeling that someone was watching him had grown stronger, gnawing at his nerves like a relentless itch. He couldn't afford to draw attention, not now, not with the baby's life in his hands. He pulled the coat tighter around the tiny bundle and quickened his pace, his mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. When he reached the soup kitchen, the familiar sight of the worn-out sign and the line of people waiting for their turn brought him a small measure of comfort. The smell of soup wafted through the air, mingling with the sounds of soft chatter and clattering dishes. Joe slipped inside, hoping to blend in with the crowd, but his presence didn't go unnoticed. Martha, an older woman with kind eyes and a heart as big as her frame, spotted Joe immediately. She had known him for years, always offering a warm smile and a few extra spoonfuls when he came by. But today, her smile faltered when she saw the bundle in his arms. "Joe, what have you got there?" she asked, concern etched in every wrinkle of her face. Joe hesitated, then gently pulled back the coat to reveal the baby's face. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Lord, Joe, where did you find this child?" "In a trash bin," Joe replied quietly, his voice laced with the disbelief he still felt. "I couldn't just leave her there, Martha. I didn't know what else to do." Martha's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to touch the baby's cheek. "You did the right thing, Joe, but we need to take her to the authorities. They'll know how to care for her." Joe's stomach tightened. He had feared this moment, the possibility of losing the child he had already begun to feel so protective of. "I don't know, Martha. What if they take her away, and she ends up in the system? What if she's safer with me?" Martha shook her head, her expression soft but firm. "Joe, you can't do this alone. You need help. This isn't just about you anymore." Before Joe could respond, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A sleek, black car parked across the street, its tinted windows obscuring whoever was inside. The same car he had seen earlier, when he left the alley. His heart pounded in his chest as a wave of fear washed over him. "We've got to go, Martha," Joe said abruptly, his voice tight with urgency. Martha looked confused but didn't argue. "Joe, wait." But Joe was already moving, clutching the baby close as he headed for the back door. He couldn't stay there, not with those eyes watching him. He needed to disappear, to find somewhere they couldn't be followed. As he pushed through the exit and out into the narrow alley behind the kitchen, he risked a glance back. The black car was still there, its engine idling ominously. Joe hurried down the alley, his heart racing. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to keep moving. The city felt like a maze, each turn leading him deeper into uncertainty. But he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to losing everything. As he slipped through the city's labyrinth of backstreets, Joe realized that he was being hunted, and the only way to survive was to stay one step ahead of the danger that now shadowed his every move. Joe's breath came in ragged gasps as he hurried through the backstreets, clutching the baby close to his chest. The labyrinth of alleys and deserted buildings seemed endless, but he knew he couldn't afford to stop, not with the ominous black car still etched in his mind. Every step felt like a race against time, a desperate bid to stay ahead of the danger that was closing in on them. He needed to find a place to hide, somewhere no one would think to look. That's when it hit him, the old abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It had once been a warehouse, long forgotten by the city's developers and left to decay. Joe had hidden there before, during the darkest days of his life, when the weight of his grief had driven him to the brink. It wasn't much, but it was safe. And right now, that's all that mattered. The journey to the warehouse felt like an eternity. Joe took every precaution, doubling back on his path and avoiding the main streets. The city, usually bustling with life, seemed eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. He finally reached the outskirts, the towering, crumbling structure looming in the distance like a ghost from the past. Joe pushed open the rusted metal door, which groaned in protest, and slipped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the small, shattered windows high above. The place was a maze of old crates and broken machinery, a perfect hiding spot for someone who didn't want to be found. Joe quickly set up a makeshift bed in a corner, using what little he could find to make the baby comfortable. As he settled down with the child, the reality of their situation hit him hard. He was no longer just a man surviving the streets. He was responsible for a tiny, vulnerable life. The baby's soft breathing was a stark reminder of how fragile she was. Joe couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness, an unfamiliar yet powerful emotion that both terrified and comforted him. The hours passed slowly, each one marked by Joe's increasing anxiety. He knew he couldn't stay in the warehouse forever. But where could they go? And how long before those hunting them caught up? Joe's thoughts spiraled, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. Every noise outside made him jump. Every shadow seemed like a threat. But through it all, the baby remained calm, her small hand occasionally reaching out to grasp his finger, as if offering him some silent reassurance. As the night drew near, Joe began to hear the faint sounds of activity outside. It started as a distant murmur, growing louder with each passing minute. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized what was happening. Victor's men were closing in. They must have tracked him somehow, and now they were combing the area, looking for any sign of him and the baby. Panic set in. Joe knew they couldn't stay there any longer. He had to move, had to find another way out. He quickly gathered what little they had and made his way to the back of the warehouse, where he remembered an old service tunnel that led out into the woods. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. The tunnel was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. Joe could barely see in front of him, but he pushed forward, driven by sheer determination. The baby stirred in his arms but didn't cry, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Joe's legs ached, and his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not until they were far away from the danger that pursued them. Finally, after what felt like hours, Joe emerged from the tunnel, the cool night air hitting his face like a welcome relief. They had made it to the woods, a dense, sprawling forest that offered some semblance of safety. But Joe knew better than to let his guard down. They were still in danger, and it was only a matter of time before Victor's men caught up. As he made his way deeper into the woods, Joe realized that running wasn't enough. He needed a plan, a way to fight back, to protect the baby from the relentless forces closing in on them. He couldn't do it alone. But who could he trust in a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty? The answer was out there, somewhere in the darkness, and Joe was determined to find it, no matter the cost. Joe's mind raced as he trekked through the dense woods, each step sinking into the damp earth beneath him. The baby had fallen asleep again, her small body curled up against his chest, unaware of the peril that surrounded them. The further they moved from the city, the quieter it became, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of an owl. But Joe's thoughts were anything but quiet. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he needed help, real help. As much as he hated to admit it, he couldn't do this alone. He thought back to the people he had known in his previous life, the ones who might still care enough to lend a hand. And that's when he remembered Sam. Sam had been a private investigator, a man who thrived on uncovering secrets and exposing the truth. Joe had crossed paths with him years ago, back when life still made sense. Sam was one of the few people who hadn't turned their back on Joe when everything fell apart. If there was anyone who could help him figure out what was going on, it was Sam. With a renewed sense of purpose, Joe changed direction, heading towards the outskirts of the city where Sam's office was located. It was risky. He knew Victor's men would be scouring the city for any trace of him, but Joe had no choice. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. It took hours to navigate his way through the woods and back into the city's fringes. By the time Joe reached Sam's office, the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets. Joe's nerves were frayed, his exhaustion evident in every step, but he forced himself to keep going. He couldn't afford to rest, not yet. Sam's office was tucked away in a nondescript building, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. Joe approached the door cautiously, his heart pounding as he knocked. For a moment, there was only silence, and Joe feared the worst. But then, the door creaked open, revealing Sam's familiar, weathered face. "Joe!" Sam's voice was thick with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I need your help, Sam," Joe replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's a long story, but I've got a baby with me, and we're in serious trouble." Sam's eyes widened as he glanced down at the sleeping child. Without another word, he stepped aside, ushering Joe into the office and locking the door behind them. The space was cluttered, filled with stacks of papers, old case files, and half-empty coffee cups. It was exactly as Joe remembered. "Sit down," Sam said, his tone urgent. "Tell me everything." Joe did as he was told, carefully settling the baby on a worn couch before collapsing into a chair. He recounted the events of the past few days, the discovery of the baby, the menacing presence of Victor Kane, the desperate flight through the city. Sam listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When Joe finished, Sam leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You've gotten yourself into a hell of a mess, Joe. This Victor Kane character, he's not just some thug. He's dangerous, connected to some very powerful people. And if he wants this baby back, it's because she's more valuable than you realize." Joe swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Sam sighed, reaching for a folder on his desk. "I've heard whispers about a criminal syndicate operating in the city. Trafficking, extortion, all the worst kinds of business. Victor's name has come up more than once. But what I didn't know was that he's got a personal stake in this. You said the baby was abandoned in a trash bin? That doesn't make sense. Victor's not the type to leave loose ends." Joe's heart sank. "So what do we do?" Sam leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Joe's. "We fight back. But first, we need to understand why this baby is so important. There's got to be more to this story, something Victor doesn't want anyone to know. I'll dig into his connections, see what I can find. But Joe, you've got to be careful. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about getting justice." Joe nodded, a newfound resolve hardening within him. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. "What do you need me to do?" "Lay low," Sam instructed. "I'll contact you as soon as I have something. And Joe, keep that baby safe." She's the key to all of this, whether we know it yet or not. Joe left Sam's office with a mix of hope and dread swirling in his chest. The answers they needed were out there, hidden beneath layers of deceit and danger. But with Sam's help, maybe, just maybe, they could bring it all to light. But as Joe walked back into the city's shadows, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. A confrontation was coming, and this time, there would be no running away. The days that followed were a blur of tension and secrecy. Joe kept a low profile, staying hidden in the safe house Sam had arranged for him and the baby. The small, windowless room felt more like a cell than a sanctuary, but Joe knew it was their only option. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware of the quiet war brewing beneath its surface. Joe spent his days pacing the small space, his mind a whirlwind of worry and fear. He couldn't stop thinking about what Sam had said, about how Emily was somehow the key to everything. But why? What was it about this innocent child that had drawn the attention of a man as dangerous as Victor Kane? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sam returned with the information Joe had been anxiously waiting for. The private investigator's face was grim as he entered the room, carrying a thick file of documents. "You're not going to like what I found, Joe," Sam said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. Joe braced himself. "Tell me." Sam sat down, opening the file and spreading out a series of photographs and papers. Victor Kane has been involved in some of the most heinous crimes this city has ever seen. Trafficking, illegal adoptions, you name it. But there's more. This baby, Emily. She's not just any child. She's Victor's granddaughter. The words hit Joe like a sledgehammer. He stared at Sam in disbelief. His granddaughter? But that doesn't make sense. Why would he abandon her like that? Sam shook his head. It's complicated. Emily's mother, Victor's daughter, died under suspicious circumstances a few months ago. She was involved in a bad crowd, mixed up in her father's business whether she wanted to be or not. There were rumors that she was trying to escape, to start a new life with Emily. But something went wrong. Joe's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. So Victor had his own granddaughter abandoned? Why? Because she's a loose end, Sam replied grimly. Victor's business thrives on control, and Emily's mother's death was a loose thread that threatened to unravel everything. Victor needed to make sure no one could trace anything back to him. But it seems like someone in his organization grew a conscience and left Emily in that alley, hoping she'd be found by someone like you. Joe's heart pounded as he absorbed the implications. Emily was not just a victim. She was the key to exposing Victor's entire operation. So, what do we do now? Sam leaned in, his voice low and serious. We use this. We expose Victor for what he really is. But it won't be easy. He's got connections everywhere, and if he finds out what we're up to, he'll stop at nothing to take us down. But we have something he doesn't. Proof. These documents tie him directly to Emily's mother's death, and to the illegal activities he's been running for years. Joe looked at the innocent child sleeping peacefully in the makeshift crib beside him. Her tiny form, so fragile yet so full of life, represented hope in a world that had shown him nothing but darkness. He knew what he had to do. We have to bring him down, Sam. For Emily. For her mother. For everyone he's hurt. Sam nodded, his expression resolute. We will. But it's going to take everything we've got. We need to gather more evidence, plan our next move carefully. We can't afford any mistakes. As they began to formulate their plan, Joe felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about giving Emily the chance at a life free from the shadows that had consumed so many others. But Joe knew the stakes were higher than ever. Victor Kane was a man who played for keeps, and if they weren't careful, they could lose everything before they even had a chance to fight. Joe Mitchell had never been a man of strategy or cunning, but desperation had a way of sharpening the mind. With Sam's help, they spent the next few days gathering the remaining pieces of evidence needed to expose Victor Kane's criminal empire. The tension was palpable as they moved from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the men who hunted them. Joe knew that this final confrontation would determine everything: their safety, their future, and most importantly, Emily's life. The plan was simple but dangerous. Joe would lure Victor into a trap, using the baby as bait to draw him out of hiding. It was a risk Joe was willing to take because he knew it was the only way to end this nightmare once and for all. Sam had arranged for the authorities to be on standby, ready to swoop in the moment they had enough evidence to arrest Victor and his men. But they needed Victor to incriminate himself, to reveal the full extent of his crimes. The rendezvous point was set at an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, a place where shadows loomed large and secrets could easily be buried. As Joe waited in the darkness, holding Emily close, he couldn't help but think about how far they had come. The cold, empty streets where he had first found her seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, everything hinged on this moment. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence. Joe's heart raced as he saw the headlights of Victor's car pierce through the darkness. The vehicle came to a stop, and for a moment, the world was still, as if time itself was holding its breath. Then, the car door opened, and Victor Kane stepped out, flanked by two of his most loyal enforcers. Victor's eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Joe. "You've been a thorn in my side, Joe. But this ends tonight." Joe felt a surge of fear but pushed it aside. He had to stay strong for Emily. "I know what you did, Victor. I know who Emily is." Victor's expression hardened. "You don't know anything. That child is mine, and I'm taking her back. Walk away now, and maybe I'll let you live." Joe shook his head, standing his ground. "I can't do that. You've hurt too many people, Victor. This ends here." Victor's lip curled into a sneer. "You really think you can stop me? You're just a washed-up drunk living on the streets. You don't stand a chance." Joe's hand tightened around the small recorder hidden in his pocket, the device that was capturing every word of this conversation. "I don't have to fight you, Victor. You've already lost." Before Victor could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Victor's men exchanged uneasy glances, and for the first time, Joe saw a flicker of doubt in Victor's eyes. "What did you do?" Victor snarled, taking a step forward. Joe didn't flinch. "It's over, Victor. The police are on their way. They have everything they need to put you away for good. It's time you paid for what you've done." Victor's face twisted with rage, and he lunged at Joe, his hand reaching for the gun tucked into his coat. But before he could draw it, the factory was flooded with blue and red lights, and the sound of shouting officers filled the air. "Drop the weapon. Hands in the air." The commands were sharp and authoritative, leaving no room for argument. Victor froze, his eyes darting around as he realized he was surrounded. His men hesitated, unsure whether to fight or flee. In that moment of confusion, Joe took a step back, shielding Emily with his body. He knew this was the endgame, the moment where everything would be decided. But Victor wasn't ready to surrender. With a defiant roar, He pulled out his gun, aiming it directly at Joe. Time seemed to slow as Joe braced himself, knowing there was no escape. Then, a gunshot rang out, but it wasn't Victor who fired. One of the officers had taken the shot, hitting Victor squarely in the shoulder. The gun fell from Victor's hand as he staggered back, clutching his wound. His men immediately surrendered, dropping their weapons as the police swarmed in. As Victor was taken into custody, his once imposing figure now hunched and defeated, Joe felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. The nightmare that had begun in a filthy alleyway had ended here, in a place just as dark but now filled with the light of justice. Joe looked down at Emily, who was still asleep in his arms, unaware of the danger that had just passed. Tears welled up in Joe's eyes as he realized what they had achieved. They had won. Against all odds, they had survived. As the police escorted Victor away, Sam approached Joe, a small smile on his face. "You did good, Joe. You saved her." Joe nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had found his way back to the light. With Victor's empire crumbling, Joe knew that Emily's future was finally secure. She would never have to know the darkness that had almost consumed her. And as for Joe, he had found a new purpose, a reason to keep going. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Joe took one last look at the factory before turning to leave, Emily safely in his arms. They walked into the morning together, leaving the shadows behind, ready to start a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope, love, and the promise of a better tomorrow. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 5 to let us know how much you like the story. Also watch the video that is currently on your screen. See you soon.